Okay, so today I'm going to talk about one of the best books I've read recently. It's called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. And when I read this book, it was really fortuitous for me. It was good timing because I had already started down with the idea of doing worthy hours. And so part of what I'm committing to do as starting this channel is I'm going to be reading a lot of books on productivity and time management. And this one I happened to pick up. It's a New York Times bestseller. And one of my local bookstores has this like New York Times bestseller shelf. And so if you go in there and you buy one of the books on their shelves, they give you a 10% off discount. And this particular bookstore, I've gone to it a couple of times. And I'm normally, okay, so this is full confession mode. I'm normally a used book girly when I go to bookstores, mostly because you can just buy more books for the same amount of money. And so it's pretty rare that I'll pay full price for a book at a bookstore. I do sometimes, but I think like in the past 6 months, I've bought maybe 2 books at full price, and the rest I usually buy like used books. So anyway, all of that to say, I saw my 10% off sticker and I was like, okay, I will get that then. And I do not regret it. It was amazing. And now, before I get into sort of my review of takeaways, because it's a New York Times bestseller, I'm not the first person to read this. I am 100% sure that you have heard about this, if time management or productivity is something you're interested in. And if you haven't, cool. I am happy to be the person to introduce you to it. But I'm going to take a different tactic with this review, and probably with most of my reviews, than what you're probably used to seeing. If you're using it as like a way to figure out whether or not you should read the book, I'm going to talk about some of my main reasons I liked it. I'm also going to bring in some things that people didn't like about it, because I looked on Goodreads. Like, for me, this book is 5 stars. It's flawless. It's perfect. I wouldn't change anything about it. And so I did want to go and see what people who didn't like it had to say about it. Let's start with what people didn't like about this book, because a lot of times I think we go into books with expectations. I think the fact that this has the word time management in the subtitle, people have a sort of expectation about what that means. And this book subverts a lot of those expectations. So one of the complaints that I heard about this book is that it doesn't have a lot of practical takeaways. And practical takeaways, something I've learned from doing a lot of audience research as a marketer and copywriter. People love practical takeaways when they're reading a book. And it's true that this book doesn't have a lot of them. Now, my edition, and I don't know if this is in everybody's edition or if everybody even read that far, but there's a book right at the end. There's an appendix right at the end called 10 Tools for Embracing Your Finitude. I think that's how you say that word. Don't at me, or just tell me if I'm wrong. And so there are some practical takeaways right at the back of the book, which are pretty cool. And I'm going to be trying a few of these and reporting back. But the majority of the book is not practical. It's more examining our relationship with time and maybe questioning some of the things that we have gotten wrong in our search to do more, or maybe questioning some of our underlying assumptions about why we want to be more productive, which is, in my opinion, excellent. But if that's not what you're looking for, if you're not looking for that, if you're like, hey, I have a really busy week and I want a book that's going to give me, some practical tips and tricks, don't pick this book up during that week. One of the reviews I read, the girl was reading it during finals week, and I was like, oh yeah, I can see why she didn't like it, because that's probably not the week that you want to be thinking deeply about the nature of time and how little we have of it. So anyway, another thing that people found less than desirable was that I saw several reviews that mentioned that it is depressing. So if you are currently grieving someone, or if, the idea of death is depressing for you, that is absolutely true. For me, it's actually comforting to be thinking about my own mortality because it's inevitable. I expect to live to, 70, 80, I'm hoping. But I do know that, eventually we all die. And I think because of my faith as a Christian, that's just something that, I've thought about a lot most of my life. And so for me, it's not really depressing to think about it. It's comforting to know that the person writing the book is thinking about it too. So, but I will say that if I was in a different mind space, maybe I just lost somebody that really mattered to me, or, maybe I was already depressed. This may not be the best book to read. So that comes with a little bit of a caveat if that's where you are. And then the final thing that people complained about was that it was repetitive. So, I will give you that as well. Like, he definitely repeats himself throughout the book. For me, those repetitions were really helpful. They reminded me of things I'd already read, like kind of brought things back together, brought them full circle, and were almost like kind of poetic. Like, he's a really good writer. And so when I saw repetition, I saw beauty and poetry, but I can understand how if you're reading this book, you may see it as annoying, right? Like, just different strokes for different folks. So those were the 3 complaints I saw about this book online. If neither of those seemed super off-putting to you, you'd probably really like it. For me, none of those were big deals with this particular book. So I want to dive into next some of the things that I thought were really helpful to consider as we're on our journey toward just being kinder to ourselves while still getting things done. So one of the things I really liked about this book is that he really examines our relationship with time in a way that I think most of us don't stop to consider. He talks about, like, he's quoting ancient sources, he's quoting modern scholars, our relationship with time and productivity. And kind of one of the main points of this book, one of the things that he repeats over and over and keeps coming back to, is that for a lot of us, especially in like Western culture, productivity for us is a means to trying to outsmart our own mortality. We're trying to cram as much into our days as we possibly can because we don't want to face the fact that one day we won't have those days. We won't be able to do those things, or we won't even exist. So we have this urge to do as much as we can to try to make an impact, or make as much of a mark as we can. But for most of us, even those of us who chase productivity constantly, that's not actually the way to live a meaningful life. I just thought that was a really refreshing and profound take. So I really liked that. He sort of starts out the book talking about that and then weaves it back in at different points. And one of the things he talks about, which is something that I've heard people talk about and that I've experienced myself, is that when you become more productive, we always think that, like, oh, if I can do my things more quickly, then that means I'm going to have more time for the things that I want to do or that really matter. And what ends up actually happening is that we fill our plate up we clear some things off our plate, like we free up some of our time, and then we just put more things into our time that we need to do. And so the question at that point is, well, if this isn't what I thought it was, like the key to having a happier and more fulfilled life, the key to connecting with people that I care about, the key to, actually having a lasting impact by doing something meaningful, then what is, right? And he leaves that question a little bit open-ended. He explores some other avenues. Like, one of the chapters that I found really thought-provoking and helpful was the one where he examines the relationship between, like, having autonomy over our time and creating community, and how those things are often diametrically opposed to each other, right? Like, if you want to connect with someone, you, by very nature of connecting with them, have to give them some control over your time. And in individualistic cultures like the US, and especially if you're like productivity obsessed, we act like the highest prize is being able to do what we want on our time. But that actually can make you pretty lonely if you actually are in that situation. So That's been really thought-provoking as well. Just thinking about that relationship and thinking, okay, because I had always assumed if I were able to organize my days perfectly, have a perfect system for everything and get everything done in a specific time frame, then I would have plenty of time and I wouldn't care if other people impinged on my time. And a lot of what he was writing about in the book is that that's just not actually true. You never get to that point where you have enough control over your time that you're able to connect with people. In fact, you only get to connect with people if you give up some of that control over your time. Another phrase that he talked about a lot, that has kind of been running through my head, living there rent-free over the past couple of weeks since I finished this book, is some things take the time they take. And what that means is not that you shouldn't try to do things efficiently or be, as fast as possible or take initiative or any of that, but that sometimes worthwhile things like, growing a garden or training a dog or raising a child or building a business, sometimes those things take the time that they take. And in the process, you get to engage, you get to be present, and you get to learn the things that you might otherwise miss if you're just trying to speed everything up and rush it along the whole time. So that's been something. We just got a dog, my husband and I, and she is so cute. She's a beagle mix. And something that beagles are notorious for is that they love to smell things. They will follow their noses and they will get lost if you don't have them on a leash or on a lead line, or in a fence that they can't dig under, which is pretty much impossible because they're good at digging. But anyway, so when I take her on walks, she is always sniffing around. And so sometimes I find myself getting a little bit impatient with her when we're walking because I'm just walk. We're here for the exercise. We're here to help you get your energy out. And then I go, wait a minute, Julianne, if you get back to the house 5 minutes later than you were planning, it's not the end of the world. Let's just let her take the time that she takes. And now obviously I'm not going to let her, sniff around forever. If she had a choice, she would stay outside her whole life. And that's just not feasible with the house that we have and the setup. But, it's been really helpful for me to just keep that phrase in mind that he uses in this book, some things take the time that they take. And on the flip side of that, he also talks about how patience is a really underrated virtue in our age, right? For most of human history, we've seen patience as something that was admirable. But recently, it's when people are impatient, it's not they wear it as a badge of honor, but it's just sort of as a given. Oh yeah, it makes sense that you're impatient because with the speed that life happens these days, it's really easy to be impatient because you don't have to wait for much of anything. And he gave some really good examples, but that's also something that I've been thinking of more and more. As a Christian, I think about patience as a fruit of the Spirit, but that's pretty much all that I think about. And sometimes I'm oh Lord, help me to be more patient, right? But I hadn't really ever thought about maybe I personally want to work on being more patient, on actively letting things take the time they take instead of trying to speed things up, actively letting them take the time that they take so that I can learn and grow in that process. So lots of things that I loved from this book, and I'm sort of recording those thoughts as sort of a note to myself so I can look back in a year or two or even farther and go oh yeah, that's where I got that thought from. I should probably quote him more often when I talk about it. And yeah, definitely recommend if any of that sounded interesting to you. It was a pretty quick read. I read it in a few days, and yeah, just really loved the things he had to say. So I'm sure this will not be the last time that you are hearing about it either if you stick around on this channel. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. Let me know your thoughts. If you've read it, I would love to hear about that. And if you haven't read it, let me know if you think you're going to read it or if you're going to skip it based on what I said. So see you in the next video.